Good morning, everyone. We are up to Kuf Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph, by the Mishnah. We're learning this Lila Nishmas Menel Mariam Bas Kalman Reuven Harashamash Ben Aliyah HaChoshesh B'Shinav, a person who feels pain in their teeth. Okay, so they have a tooth pain. So Lo Yikama Behenas HaChometz, you're not allowed to sip vinegar. Tabalu Kedarka, you're allowed to dip your food in vinegar in the usual manner. Vinegar, keep in mind, was like the dip. That was the classic dip that they dipped everything into. So you're not allowed to just drink the vinegar, but if you dip your bread or your food into the vinegar, then you're allowed to do so. And if you get cured, you're cured. In other words, again, this is all going back to that prohibition against doing therapeutic or medicinal functions in an overt fashion. But if you do so in a way that's kind of covert, so you're doing it because you're just eating, even though your intention is that you're doing it for health purposes, but medicinal purposes, but ultimately you're doing it in a way that's normative, because people would typically dip their food into vinegar, then it's okay. HaChoshesh b'masnav, a person who feels pain in their loins. Lo yasuch yain b'chometz, they're not allowed to smear themselves with wine or vinegar. That is irregular. Aval sachu es Hashem, they're allowed to smear themselves with oil. V'lo shemen vered, but not with rose oil. B'nei malachim sachem shemen vered. Al-makosei, and princes are allowed to smear rose oil on their wound. Shekin darkan lasuch b'chol, because princes would smear rose oil. Rose oil was very expensive. Rav Shimon Omer, Kol Yisrael b'nei malachim him. All of Yisrael, all the Jewish people are like princes. Okay, and therefore they're allowed to apply rose oil. So what Rav Shimon means over here is that since there are some people who are allowed to do it, everyone's allowed to do it. We don't make exceptions. Once we say that there are some people in our society who are allowed to do it, we treat everyone the same way. Okay. Ramile Rav. No, we have a contradiction. Ramile Rav Acha Aricha. Rav Acha Aricha. That means the tall Rav Acha asked a contradiction to Rav Acha Bar Papa. Rav Acha's real name is Rav Acha, the son of Papa. Le Rabbi Avo. He asked the following question from Avo. It's not. We learned in the Mishnah. HaChoshesh b'Shinav, a person who has pain in their teeth, Lo Yikama Behenas HaChometz, is not allowed to sip vinegar through them. Lememra dechometz ma'al l'shinayim, to say that this implies that vinegar is good for one's teeth. V'hachsiv, but at the same time it says in the pasuk chometz l'shinayim b'chashan l'einayim, that like vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes. So we see this is a pasuk that's speaking at the end of the pasuk says, so is a lazy person to those who send him. In other words, a lazy person is referred to like vinegar to the teeth. Obviously it's a negative thing. So on the one hand you're telling me that vinegar is good for the teeth, at the same time this pasuk says that vinegar is not good for a person. So which one is it? Lokashi says no contradiction. Habachamra defri. The pasuk, when it refers to vinegar to the teeth in a negative sense, oh boy, it's getting bumpy, hope it's not giving you a headache. So it says like vinegar to the teeth, that refers to the acid, was that the word? Acid juice of unripe fruit. In other words, there is juices that come out of a fruit which are unripe, and that is a type of a vinegar. Habachala, the vinegar that's good for one's mouth, that is regular classic vinegar. Yibaisem, another answer, habachala. They're both referring to vinegar, both in our Mishnah and in the pasuk that refers to vinegar as being negative. They're both referring to vinegar. Hadi'ikamaka, hadalekamaka. When the Mishnah that says that it's helpful is when there's a wound, when there's a pain in the teeth. The pasuk which says it's bad is when there is no wound. Ikamaka masi. When there's a wound, vinegar helps the teeth. Leikamaka marabe. But when there is no wound, the vinegar actually loosens the teeth and it's not good for the teeth. Okay, let's go for the Mishnah. The Gemara quotes the Mishnah. Leikama bahen esachome. It's a person who has pains in their teeth should not sip vinegar. About Tanya, we have another brayso that says lo yigama ufole. It's a person shouldn't sip and spit it out. So the second brayso, this brayso that we have, is telling us that you are allowed. The implication is aval megama uvole. You're allowed to swallow it. You're just not allowed to swallow it and spit it out. So if you're spitting it out, then it makes it very clear that what you're doing is for medicinal purposes. But if you're swallowing it, the implication is that it's okay. So right. So on the one hand, our Mishnah said you can't swallow it. The brayso says you're not allowed to swallow and spit it out. But if you're just swallowing it, it would be fine. Amar Abaye kitznan nami masnisan. Our Mishnah also, even though it only said you can't swallow, what it really meant was megama ufoleitnan. It meant that you're not allowed to sip and spit it out. But if you sip and swallow it, it actually is allowed. Okay, so basically he's rereading our Mishnah. Rava tries to give another answer. Rava Amar afilu tema megama uvoleha kan lefnei tibul kan la'achar tibul. So Rava says no. Really, our Mishnah prohibits sipping and swallowing. Okay, really swallowing is problematic, and yet the other brayso implies that swallowing is okay. So what's the difference? One is quote unquote before dipping. What does it mean before dipping? During a meal. A meal was referred to as a dipping session because the way they ate their food, they didn't have forks and knives. They would have like a piece of bread, they would dip it into the meat, they would dip it into the vinegar, they would dip it into things. So during the meal, or literally before a meal, but during a meal, then sipping, drinking the vinegar is fine because it's part of a meal. After a meal, when it's no longer part of the meal, then already you are therefore, then it's very evident that what you're doing is for medicinal purposes, and therefore it is not allowed. Okay, it says the Gemara v'nema delifnei tibul shari, but let him say that there is a concept of since. V'nema delifnei tibul shari, since it's permitted during the meal, it should also be allowed during the meal. Says Rava has a principle called since. Let me just read a little further and explain. Rava says, Leika midi de b'shavas shari, uv'yom kippurim aser, hold b'shavas shari, b'yom kippurim nami shari. Okay, so referring to this follows. The Gemara speaks about going to a mikvah on Yom Kippur, and which is going to be forbidden rabbinically, and Rava comes along and says, no, it's going to be permitted. Since on Shabbos it's permitted, it's therefore going to be permitted on Yom Kippur. In other words, once something is permitted, it's permitted all the way through, across the board. So the same thing over here. Once something is permitted, if vinegar is going to be permitted, according to Rava, this principle of since should tell us it's going to be permitted not only during a meal, but after a meal as well. And therefore, ultimately, Gemara says, Hadarbe Rava mehach. Rava goes back, he retracts what he said, and he goes back to and we basically fall back to the answer of Abaye, which says that really you are allowed to swallow vinegar, you're not allowed to swallow and spit vinegar, and we have to reread our Mishnah. Ask the Gemara, now, there's a contradiction in Rava that forces us to say that Rava goes back from his interpretation of our Mishnah. Maybe he goes back from his interpretation of the teaching about Yom Kippur. How do we know he goes back from this teaching? So Gemara says, no, don't say that to Tanya, because there's a brisa, there's something more primary, which Rava is bound to in the brisa, which says, there's a brisa which says that you go to do tefillah, you immerse on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, and therefore Rava is bound to that brisa. And whereas when it comes to our Mishnah, he's able to reread it and read it like Abaye, which basically comes out that you are allowed to drink vinegar, whether it's before a meal or after a meal. What is not allowed is spitting out the vinegar. Okay, let's go a little bit further. Person who feels pain in his loins. Amaravi Abba Brazav Amarav. Halacha Rabbi Shimon. The halacha is like Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon was the one who said that everyone is like a prince, and therefore everyone is allowed to have the rose oil. Ask the Gemara, Lemima to Rav, who just said this halacha, Rabbi Shimon's fairly. That means that Rav goes like Rabbi Shimon. Now again, Rabbi Shimon, if you recall, throughout the entire Masechta, has a more lenient view about many of the laws of Shabbos. So we assume that if you hold like him by one of these laws, you're going to hold by him for all these laws. So therefore, the Gemara is now going to ask, how could it be that you're telling me Rav holds like Rav Shimon over here? We're about to see he does not hold of him elsewhere. Where? How do we know that? Rav Shimi Barchia Mishmei de Rav. Rav Shimi Barchia said in the name of Rav, Hai Misochuraya de Nazaisa, the stopper of a barrel. Keep in mind, there are barrels back in the day. No, not even back in the day. There's a little spigot, and basically they would stuff it with they would take a cloth and they would push it in. So he says, Rav, Asr lahadoka b'yamtiv. You're not allowed to push it into its place in Yamtiv, and certainly not on Shabbos. Now that does not seem to go like Rav Shimon, right? If you remember, Rav Shimon holds Davar Shem Miskavin is mutter, something which is not your intention, it's permitted. So the fact that Rav says you're not allowed to stuff this rag into the spigot would seem to not go like Rav Shimon. The Gemara says no. But here, Rav Shimon, this actually does go like Rav Shimon because of the we had a principle there of Shimon, although he does not allow something which is not your intention. He says it's permitted to do something if it's not your intention. That's only if it's not inevitable that this secondary effect will take place. Like when you're dragging the bench, and it may or may not create a groove. But if you're doing something which most definitely will cause this effect, so when you're squeezing a little rag into a spigot, it's definitely going to do schita, something like to squeeze out the wine from the rag, and therefore even Rav Shimon would agree over there. Says the Gemara, another question on this idea that Rav holds like Rav Shimon. We see elsewhere that Rav says the halacha is like Rav Yehuda. Rav Shimon, and it's Shmuel who says the halacha is Rav Shimon. Rav Chia bar Avin masni below Gavri, and Rav Chia bar Avin teaches the same idea just without all the middle people. Rav Amar Rav Yehuda, Shmuel Amar Rav Shimon. So we see clearly that Rav holds like Rav Yehuda. So another answer. Elamarava ani varish b'chabura targime. I and the line of our group interpreted Rav's statements regarding rose oil, so it doesn't contradict his other statements. Okay, Manu, who's the lion of his group? Rabbi Chia bar Avin. Rabbi Chia bar Avin was known as the lion. So again, let's just understand halacha. So let's understand what we're trying to address over here, or review. Rav said the halacha is like Rav Shimon, and yet over here regarding the rose oil, and yet elsewhere in regards to other halachos, he says the halacha is like Rav Yehuda, the more machmer one, and not like Rav Shimon. So how do we reconcile these two things? So Rav says halach Rav Shimon v'lami tameh. What Rav meant to say was the halacha is like Rav Shimon over here, that rose oil can be used by everyone, but not because of his reasoning. Rav Shimon had based on his general reasoning that he held of this leniency across the board, and Rav Shimon Rav Shimon holds his leniency across the board, and that's why he holds the rose oil can be used by everyone. Rav paskins like him, but not because he agrees to Rav Shimon. Really, he holds like Rav Yehuda, really has the more machmir view. So why over here does he hold like Rav Shimon? My halach Rav Shimon v'la mitamei, ilay malach Rav Shimon deshari. Maybe you want to say the halacha is like Rav Shimon who permits it v'la mitamei, and not for the reason, meaning we're suggesting one possible interpretation. De'ilu Rav Shimon savar masi. Rav Shimon holds that it healed. Rav savar lo masi, and Rav holds that this oil does not heal, and that's why it's allowed. But that can't be. We learned the fact that the Mishnah said that princes use this, obviously it's a healing, it has the healing functions. Ella, what does it mean? Rather, Rav is saying the halacha is like Rav Shimon who permits the use of rose oil, but not for his reasoning. Because Rav Shimon holds that rose oil is permitted even though it's not common. For Rav Savar, and if it's common, you are allowed to use it. And he disagrees with Rav Shimon. He says if it's not common, you can't use it. So why does he say the halacha is like Rav Shimon? Because of Rav Shchicha Mishcha Devarda. In Rav's area, rose oil was common, and that's why he's saying you are allowed to use rose oil on Shabbos, because according to him, it is a common substance. Okay, therefore it's permitted, but not because of Rav Shimon's lenient ruling. Have a great day. We finished we finished the parak. We're going to start a new parak, God willing, tomorrow.